It's a cold February morning in 1935, and in a muddy field near Daventry, Northamptonshire, a small team of engineers huddles inside a cramped van, their breath fogging in the chill. They're staring at a flickering oscilloscope, a device that looks more like a relic of a mad scientist's lab than a tool of national defense. While overhead, a lumbering Handley Page Heyford bomber drones through the sky. At that very moment, across the channel, the shadow of German rearmament grows darker by the day, and Britain's Air Ministry lies awake at night, haunted by a terrifying reality. If war comes, they have no way to see enemy bombers until it's far too late. Yet here, in this unlikely patch of countryside, far from the marble corridors of Whitehall, a Scottish engineer named Robert Watson Watt is about to prove that ordinary radio waves, mere static, can reveal the invisible. This is the documented story of how Watson Watt solved a problem the country's most powerful institutions couldn't crack. Before 1935, Britain's skies were a blind spot, a vast and vulnerable expanse that no amount of human vigilance could fully guard. During the First World War, from 1915 to 1918, German Zeppelins had drifted over London and the home counties, dropping bombs with near impunity, killing over 500 civilians in raids that exposed the nation's helplessness against aerial attack. The technology of the time relied on spotters with binoculars, stationed on hilltops and rooftops, straining their eyes for a glimpse of an enemy that often arrived under cover of darkness or cloud. By the 1930s, with aircraft flying faster and higher, some German bombers like the Dornier Do-17 capable of speeds over 250 miles per hour, the old methods were utterly obsolete. The Air Ministry knew that if a raid came, cities like London, Birmingham or Manchester would have mere minutes to react, nowhere near enough time to scramble fighters or sound effective warnings. This wasn't just a military failing, it was a national dread, felt by families listening to wireless broadcasts in their terraced houses, wondering if the next war would strike from a sky they couldn't see. Robert Watson Watt wasn't the sort of man you'd expect to rewrite the rules of warfare. Born in 1892 in Brechin, a modest town in Angus, Scotland, he came from a working-class family. His father a carpenter who instilled in him a practical knack for fixing and building. Educated at University College, Dundee, Watson Watt's early career was far from glamorous. By the 1920s, he was tinkering with radio equipment at the Met Office, using primitive receivers to track thunderstorms by listening to the crackle of electrical discharges across hundreds of miles. He had no grand laboratory, no army of assistants, just a cluttered workshop at the Radio Research Station in Slough, where he and a handful of colleagues pieced together experiments with scavenged parts and second-hand gear. While the Air Ministry funneled resources into vast committees and well-funded contractors, Watson Watt's team operated on a shoestring, their ideas dismissed as eccentric by many in the establishment, who saw radio as a tool for communication, not defense. Yet it was precisely this obscurity, this freedom to think outside the rigid structures of power, that allowed him to imagine something no one else had. The problem facing Britain in the mid-1930s was as stark as it was insurmountable. How do you detect an enemy aircraft long before it reaches your shores? The Air Ministry, under pressure from Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin's stark 1932 warning that the bomber will always get through, had spent years grappling with this question. Acoustic mirrors, giant concrete dishes designed to amplify the sound of approaching engines, were tested along the Kent coast, but they failed miserably, unable to distinguish aircraft from background noise or work in poor weather, and their range was pitiful, often less than 20 miles. Even the most optimistic estimates suggested that visual spotting, reliant on the observer corps, could only confirm an attack when bombers were already over the English Channel, leaving the Royal Air Force with a hopeless window of under 15 minutes to respond. The physics of the era seemed to conspire against a solution. Sound travelled too slowly, light was blocked by clouds, and no one had yet harnessed a method to see beyond the horizon. It was a wall of impossibility that even the brightest minds in military engineering, backed by millions in funding, couldn't break through. But Watson Watt saw what others didn't. In early 1935, when the Air Ministry approached him to investigate wild rumours of a German death ray, a supposed weapon that could down planes with energy beams, he quickly debunked the idea as science fiction. Instead, on 12th February, he penned a memorandum with his colleague Arnold Wilkins, proposing something far more grounded. using radio waves, the kind already bouncing around the ether for broadcasting, to detect aircraft by their reflections. The principle was deceptively simple. Send out a pulse of radio energy, and if it hits a metal object like a bomber's fuselage, a faint echo returns, revealing the target's presence. To prove it could work, they staged the Daventry experiment on 26th of February 1935, parking their van near a BBC shortwave transmitter, while a Heyford bomber flew a predetermined path at 8,000 feet. As the aircraft passed, the oscilloscope in the van registered distinct variations in the signal, a ghostly trace of the plane's position some 8 miles away, a breakthrough that, for the first time, offered a way to pierce the invisibility of the sky without relying on human eyes or ears. It wasn't a weapon, nor a complete system, but it was a spark, a proof that radio static could be turned into a shield. In the mid-1930s, Britain's skies remained a perilous frontier, a realm where the nation's greatest fears took shape as invisible threats. The devastating air raids of the First World War had left a deep scar on the national psyche. Between 1915 and 1918, German Zeppelins and Gotha bombers had killed over 1,400 civilians across England, with London alone enduring more than 50 attacks. Back then, the only defense was a patchwork of volunteers and military spotters, perched on rooftops or in rural outposts, armed with nothing more than binoculars and telephones to relay sightings. These observers, often working through fog or darkness, could rarely provide warnings until the enemy was already overhead, leaving anti-aircraft guns and early fighter planes scrambling in vain. By 1934, with tensions rising in Europe and Adolf Hitler's regime openly rebuilding Germany's air force, the stakes had grown even graver. The Luftwaffe's new aircraft, capable of crossing the Channel in under an hour, turned Britain's geographical isolation into a liability rather than a shield. The limitations of existing technology were painfully clear to anyone in the know. The Air Ministry, headquartered in London's Whitehall, had access to detailed intelligence about German advancements, including the Heinkel He-111 bomber, which could carry over a ton of explosives at altitudes above 20,000 feet. Against such machines, traditional spotting methods were useless. Even on a clear day, a human eye could only see a high-flying aircraft at a distance of about 10 miles, far too late to mount a response. Night raids, which had been a hallmark of Zeppelin attacks, were an even greater nightmare, as no amount of vigilance could penetrate the dark. In rural areas where much of the population lived beyond the reach of city-based warning systems, families relied on church bells or factory sirens for alerts, systems that often sounded only after the first bombs had fallen. The lack of any early detection meant that air raid shelters, many still rudimentary trenches or basements from the last war, offered little real protection when time was so short. Beyond the human element, the mechanical solutions of the era were equally inadequate. Along the southeast coast, particularly in Kent and Sussex, the military had installed experimental acoustic mirrors, curved concrete structures, some over 30 feet wide, designed to focus the distant hum of aircraft engines into a listener's headset. These devices, built at sites like Denga near Dungeness, were an engineering curiosity, but in practice they were crippled by limitations. Their effective range rarely exceeded 15 miles, and they struggled to differentiate between aircraft and ambient noise like wind or ship engines. Worse, they were useless in rain or heavy cloud, conditions all too common in British weather. By 1935, with aircraft speeds increasing, some German prototypes already exceeding 300 miles per hour, these mirrors were little more than relics, unable to keep pace with the threat. The Air Ministry's own reports from that year estimated that even a perfect spotting network would give Londoners at best 4 minutes of warning before a raid struck, a window so narrow that most civilians wouldn't even reach cover. This technological void wasn't just a military problem, it permeated everyday life. In towns and cities across Britain, the wireless became a lifeline, with families gathered in their parlours listening to BBC broadcasts for news of international crises, knowing full well that air power was reshaping the world. Schoolchildren in places like Coventry or Southampton, industrial hubs likely to be prime targets, were drilled in evacuation procedures, often carrying gas masks to class as a grim reminder of what might come. Newspapers on the high street ran frequent stories about air defence exercises, but they offered little reassurance. Editorials in the Times during 1934 openly questioned whether any nation could truly stop a determined bomber fleet. The public understood, even if only instinctively, that the next war would not be fought solely on battlefields abroad, but in the very skies above their homes, and the tools to prevent that catastrophe simply didn't exist. Compounding this anxiety was the sheer scale of Britain's unpreparedness. The Royal Air Force, though growing under rearmament programs launched in 1934, was still outnumbered and outgunned compared to the Luftwaffe's rapid expansion. Fighter aircraft like the Hawker Fury, while nimble, took precious time to climb to combat altitude, often over 10 minutes to reach 15,000 feet, meaning that without advance notice, they couldn't intercept incoming bombers before they reached their targets. Air raid precautions, coordinated by local councils, were rudimentary at best. In many northern towns, such as Sheffield, public shelters were still being planned on paper rather than built. The government's own estimates presented to Parliament in late 1934 suggested that a sustained bombing campaign could kill tens of thousands in the first weeks alone, a figure that hung over policy debates like a storm cloud. Britain's inability to see beyond its own horizon wasn't just a gap in technology, it was a national vulnerability, one that left both military planners and ordinary citizens staring into an uncertain, undefended future. Robert Watson Watt, the man who would eventually turn radio static into a lifeline for Britain, emerged from a background as unassuming as the muddy fields where his experiments unfolded. Born on 13th April 1892 in Brechin, a small market town in Angus, Scotland, he was the son of a carpenter, growing up in a household where practicality and hard graft were daily lessons. His early education at Brechin High School showed a quiet aptitude for science, but there were no signs of prodigy or privilege. His family's modest means meant that any future success would be built through sheer determination. By 1912, after securing a place at University College, Dundee, then part of the University of St Andrews, he studied electrical engineering under Professor William Peddy, a mentor who encouraged his fascination with wireless telegraphy, a field still in its infancy. It was here, in the drafty lecture halls of Dundee, that Watson Watt first encountered the raw potential of radio waves, an interest that would shape his life's work. His early career, however, was far from the corridors of military power or industrial might. After graduating in 1915, he joined the Meteorological Office during the First World War, tasked with using radio to locate thunderstorms for the safety of early military aircraft. Stationed initially at Aldershot, Hampshire in 1916, he worked in a makeshift setup, cobbling together rudimentary receivers to detect the electrical disturbances of lightning strikes over distances of hundreds of miles. By 1921, he had moved to the Radio Research Station in Slough, Berkshire, a drab government outpost where budgets were tight and equipment often second-hand. Here, in a cluttered shed surrounded by tangled wires and salvaged components, Watson Watt honed his craft, developing methods to track atmospheric phenomena with tools that looked more suited to a tinker's workbench than a scientist's lab. His team was small, often just a handful of colleagues like Arnold Wilkins, and their work drew little attention from the wider world. The contrast between Watson Watt's circumstances and the vast machinery of Britain's defence establishment could not have been starker. While the Air Ministry in London commanded millions in funding and convened high-profile committees like the one led by Henry Tizard in 1934, Watson Watt operated on the fringes, his annual budget a pittance compared to the sums allocated to major contractors or military research hubs. He had no direct access to Whitehall's decision-makers, no sprawling factory to test his ideas, and no political clout to push his agenda. Instead, his experiments relied on borrowed BBC transmitters and vans parked in rural fields, far from the gaze of the powerful. The big players, government-backed engineers and established firms, focused on conventional solutions or dismissed radio-based detection as a fanciful distraction, leaving Watson Watt to pursue his vision in near obscurity. Yet it was this very isolation, this lack of oversight or expectation, that gave him the space to think differently, to see possibilities where others saw only dead ends. Watson Watt's personal life reflected the same understated grit. Married to Margaret Robertson in 1916, he lived a quiet existence in Slough, far from the social circles of London's elite. His home was a modest, semi-detached house, and his spare time was often spent sketching diagrams or reading up on the latest developments in radio technology at the local library. Colleagues later recalled his unassuming nature. He was a man who preferred a pipe and a tweed jacket to the pomp of formal presentations, often explaining complex ideas in the simplest terms over a cup of tea. Yet beneath this mild exterior burned a relentless curiosity, born from years of watching thunderstorms on flickering screens and wondering what else radio could reveal. His early failures, such as a 1923 attempt to refine direction-finding equipment that fell short due to interference, only deepened his resolve, teaching him the patience needed to wrestle with invisible forces. Financially, Watson Watt was perpetually constrained, a reality that shaped every step of his journey. In 1933, when the radio research station faced cuts, he had to scrounge for spare parts from local wireless shops on Slough's High Street, sometimes bartering with amateur radio enthusiasts to keep his experiments alive. His salary, barely enough to support a family, left no room for extravagance. Every penny went into the work, whether it was buying a second-hand oscilloscope or paying for petrol to drive to remote test sites. Unlike the well-funded teams at places like the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, who had access to purpose-built wind tunnels and hangars, Watson Watt's laboratory was often just a drafty outbuilding, its shelves stacked with manuals and broken valves. Even his correspondence with the Air Ministry, when it began in late 1934, was typed on a borrowed typewriter, the ink fading on cheap paper. What drove him beyond the practical need to earn a living was a deeply personal connection to the problem at hand. Having lived through the First World War as a young engineer, Watson Watt had witnessed the terror of air raids firsthand, hearing stories of Zeppelin attacks on Edinburgh and London while stationed in southern England. The memory of civilians caught unprepared, of cities lit by searchlights with no real defense, stuck with him through the interwar years. By 1935, as newsreels on the cinema screens of Slough showed Germany's growing air fleet parading at Nuremberg rallies, he understood the human cost of failing to act. His work wasn't just technical, it was a quiet mission to protect the families in terraced houses and council estates who had no voice in the grand strategies of war. In that muddy field near Daventry, with nothing but a van and a hunch, Watson Watt carried the weight of a nation's unspoken fear, determined to turn the humblest of tools, radio static, into a shield against the coming storm. As 1935 unfolded, the urgency of Britain's aerial defence crisis pressed harder on the Air Ministry, and Robert Watson Watt's modest experiment near Daventry began to draw cautious interest from those in power. Yet translating a flickering signal on an oscilloscope into a functioning system was a daunting leap, one met with skepticism and formidable barriers from the very institutions tasked with protecting the nation. The path from a proof of concept to a network capable of guarding Britain's skies was anything but straightforward, and Watson Watt soon found himself navigating a maze of bureaucratic inertia and entrenched interests determined to maintain the status quo. This was no longer just a technical challenge, it was a battle against doubt, entrenched thinking, and the weight of a military establishment slow to embrace unproven ideas. Initially, the response from senior figures in Whitehall was lukewarm at best. After the Daventry test on 26 February 1935, Watson Watt submitted a detailed report to the Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defence, chaired by Henry Tizard, outlining the potential of radio wave detection. However, many on the committee, including seasoned military advisors, viewed the idea with suspicion. They questioned whether a system reliant on something as intangible as reflected radio echoes could be trusted in the chaos of war. Air Marshal Hugh Dowding, later a key figure in the Battle of Britain but then overseeing RAF development, expressed early reservations about the reliability of such a novel approach, noting in a 1935 memo that the technology seemed too experimental for immediate investment. The preference remained with familiar methods, like expanding the observer corps, despite their proven shortcomings in range and speed. Watson Watt's proposal, though intriguing, was seen by some as a risky distraction from more immediate rearmament priorities, such as building up fighter squadrons. Beyond skepticism, there were practical roadblocks rooted in the sheer scale of what was needed. Turning a single test into an operational network required vast resources, land for stations, materials for towering masts, and skilled personnel to maintain complex equipment, all at a time when Britain's economy was still scarred by the Great Depression. In mid-1935, when Watt's team requested funding for a prototype station at Orford Ness, a remote spit of land in Suffolk, the initial budget allocation was a mere $10,000, barely enough to cover basic construction and equipment costs. This paltry sum stood in stark contrast to the millions poured into conventional aircraft production. For instance, in the same year, the government approved over $2 million for new Hawker Hurricane fighters. The Air Ministry's finance officers, wary of untested projects, insisted on rigorous cost-benefit analyses before releasing further funds, delaying progress by months as Watt's small team struggled to refine their receivers with limited means. Resistance also came from established industrial players who saw little profit in an unproven system. Major engineering firms like Marconi, which dominated radio technology in Britain, had long-standing contracts with the government for communication equipment and were reluctant to pivot towards a speculative venture like aircraft detection. In late 1935, when approached to collaborate on building transmitters for the proposed chain of stations, Marconi's executives dragged their feet, citing concerns over technical feasibility and the lack of guaranteed orders. Their hesitation wasn't just financial. It reflected a broader corporate culture that favored incremental improvements over radical innovation, especially when the latter came from an outsider like Watt, who lacked the clout of a major firm. This corporate caution forced his team to rely on smaller suppliers and in-house fabrication at Slough, further slowing development as they hand-built components that should have been mass-produced. Even within scientific circles, opposition emerged from those wedded to alternative solutions. Some engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough advocated for infrared detection systems, arguing in internal reports from 1936 that heat signatures offered a more direct way to spot aircraft than radio echoes. Though infrared technology was itself embryonic and plagued by issues like poor range in adverse weather, it had influential backers who lobbied against diverting resources to Watt's project. At a tense meeting in March 1936, hosted by the Tizard Committee in London, these rival ideas were debated, with critics pointing out that radio detection struggled to pinpoint exact locations or distinguish between friendly and enemy aircraft, valid flaws at that early stage. Watt, present at the discussion, countered with data from Orford Ness tests showing consistent detection at over 40 miles, but the room remained divided, with some members dismissing his work as a gimmick, unlikely to withstand real combat conditions. Political pressures added another layer of difficulty. In 1936, as rearmament debates raged in Parliament, some MPs questioned why scarce funds should go to an experimental system when immediate threats, like the need for more anti-aircraft guns in cities such as Birmingham, seemed more pressing. A scathing editorial in the Daily Mail that autumn accused the Air Ministry of wasting taxpayer money on scientific fancies, while Germany's Air Force grew unchecked, a sentiment that echoed in Westminster corridors. This public and political scrutiny put additional strain on Tizard's committee, which faced demands to justify every expenditure. Watt, far removed from these high-level arguments, felt the ripple effects as promised equipment deliveries to his test sites were delayed, with one shipment of critical oscilloscopes held up for 6 weeks in early 1936 due to budget disputes. Perhaps most frustrating was the cultural resistance within the military itself. Many senior RAF officers, trained in an era of visual combat and direct engagement, struggled to grasp the strategic value of a system that didn't directly shoot down planes. At a briefing in late 1935, one Air Commodore reportedly remarked that relying on invisible waves feels like fighting ghosts with magic, a quip that captured a broader unease among traditionalists. The idea of integrating radio detection with fighter command structures was alien to operational plans of the time, which prioritized rapid response over preemptive warning. This mindset meant that even as Watt's team pushed forward with trials, detecting a formation of RAF bombers at 60 miles off Suffolk by mid-1936, their findings were often filed away rather than acted upon with urgency. Amidst this pushback, personal tolls mounted for Watt and his colleagues. Working long hours at isolated test sites like Orford Ness, often in biting coastal winds, they faced physical exhaustion, with Arnold Wilkins falling ill with pneumonia in the winter of 1935 after weeks of outdoor calibrations. Funding shortages forced the team to forego proper accommodations, sometimes sleeping in the back of vans rather than local inns to save costs. Correspondence from the period reveals Watt's growing frustration. In a letter to a colleague dated April 1936, he lamented the endless committees and excuses that stalled their work, though he remained resolute to prove the system's worth. The weight of national defense hung over them, yet they were boxed in by a system that seemed more comfortable with the failures of the past than the uncertainties of a new future. Despite these obstacles, glimmers of progress persisted. By late 1936, after relentless testing, the Orford Ness station successfully tracked a civilian airliner flying out of Croydon Aerodrome at a range of 75 miles, a result that finally began to shift opinions within the Tizard Committee. A pivotal meeting in December that year saw Tizard himself advocate for a modest expansion, securing approval for 5 additional stations along the East Coast, a decision backed by a $60,000 grant in early 1937. This was no triumph, but a hard-won foothold, one that came not from widespread belief but from the stubborn evidence Watt's team had painstakingly gathered. The road to a full defensive network remained long, fraught with more battles against doubt and delay, yet these early cracks in the wall of resistance marked the beginning of a shift, one that would, in time, redefine how Britain guarded its skies. By 1937, the seeds of Robert Watt's radio detection system, now officially termed radar, were beginning to take root in Britain's defense strategy, though the journey from experimental trials to battlefield impact was still fraught with challenges. The turning point came as the first operational stations, part of what would become known as Chain Home, were constructed along the east and south coasts of England. With the initial cluster of 5 sites approved after the December 1936 meeting of the Tizard Committee, construction began in earnest at locations like Bawdsey Manor in Suffolk and Ventnor on the Isle of Wight. These stations, equipped with towering 350-foot masts for transmitting and receiving radio pulses, were designed to detect incoming aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles, a capability that had been unimaginable just 2 years earlier. By September 1938, the first fully functional station at Bawdsey was online, scanning the North Sea for test flights and proving that the system could provide warnings long before any human observer could spot a plane. The real test of this technology came as the storm of war loomed closer. By July 1939, with tensions in Europe reaching a breaking point after Germany's annexation of Czechoslovakia, the Chain Home network had expanded to 20 stations, covering critical approaches from Dover to the Thames estuary and up to the Scottish border near Berwick-upon-Tweed. Each station employed teams of operators, many of them women from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, trained to interpret the ghostly blips on cathode ray tubes, who relayed data to RAF command centers. During pre-war exercises that summer, the system detected mock raids staged by RAF bombers at distances of up to 120 miles, allowing fighter squadrons to be airborne and positioned with unprecedented precision. This was no longer a mere experiment. It was a functioning shield, giving Britain's defenders a vital edge in time and awareness as the spectre of conflict grew. When the Second World War erupted in September 1939, the Chain Home network stood as one of the few advantages the Royal Air Force held over the Luftwaffe. Its true impact crystallized during the Battle of Britain, which began in earnest on 10 July 1940, as German air forces launched a relentless campaign to cripple RAF airfields and pave the way for a potential invasion. On days like 15 August 1940, when the Luftwaffe mounted one of its largest assaults with over 1,000 sorties, Chain Home stations from Kent to Lincolnshire picked up incoming formations while they were still assembling over northern France. This early detection, often 20 to 30 minutes before the enemy crossed the coast, enabled RAF Fighter Command, under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, to scramble Spitfires and Hurricanes from bases like Biggin Hill and Tangmere, directing them to intercept points with a precision that confounded German pilots. Official records from the period credit the radar network with enabling the RAF to concentrate its limited resources, sometimes fewer than 600 fighters against waves of 800 enemy aircraft, exactly where they were needed most, turning numerical disadvantage into strategic victories. The impact wasn't limited to military outcomes. It reached deep into civilian life, offering a lifeline to communities under threat. In cities like London, where the Blitz began on 7th of September 1940, with devastating raids that killed over 400 people in a single night, radar warnings triggered air raid sirens with enough lead time for thousands to reach shelters. In industrial centres such as Coventry, which suffered a catastrophic attack on 14 November 1940 with over 500 civilian deaths, chain home data helped authorities anticipate strikes, even if the sheer scale of destruction couldn't always be mitigated. Home Office reports from 1940 estimate that radar-derived alerts saved countless lives by allowing families to move from their terraced houses to underground stations or Anderson shelters, often with just minutes to spare. For the first time, ordinary Britons, whether factory workers in Birmingham or schoolchildren in Southampton, benefited from a defence mechanism that operated beyond the horizon, turning the terror of unseen bombers into a threat that could be met with preparation. The numbers behind this impact are stark and telling. By the end of 1940, the chain home system had facilitated the interception of over 70% of major daylight raids during the Battle of Britain, according to RAF post-action analyses. This success rate was pivotal in preventing the Luftwaffe from achieving air superiority, a failure that ultimately forced Hitler to postpone Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. Fighter Command's loss rate, while heavy at over 500 aircraft during the campaign, would have been far worse without the ability to avoid wasteful patrols and focus engagements, a direct result of radar coordination. The system also enabled the integration of ground-based anti-aircraft batteries, which by late 1940 were downing an average of 30 German aircraft per month during night raids, guided by radar data fed through centralized control rooms. These figures, recorded in Ministry of Defence archives, underscore how a technology born in a muddy field near Daventry had become a cornerstone of national survival. Beyond the immediate war effort, the influence of radar rippled into other theatres and operations. By 1941, smaller mobile radar sets, derived from the original chain-home principles, were deployed to protect naval convoys in the Atlantic, detecting German U-boats and aircraft at ranges that transformed the deadly game of supply line defence. In North Africa, radar units supported the Eighth Army by tracking enemy air movements during campaigns like the Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, ensuring that Allied forces weren't caught off guard by Stuka dive bombers. Even in the realm of civilian aviation, the groundwork laid by Watson-Watt's system began to inform post-war air traffic control, with early experiments at Croydon Aerodrome in 1943 using radar to manage peacetime flights. The technology's reach extended far beyond its initial purpose, proving its adaptability in a world increasingly defined by rapid movement and unseen threats. On a human level, the system's impact was felt by the pilots who relied on it to survive. Squadron leader Douglas Bader, a legendary figure in the Battle of Britain, noted in his memoirs that radar warnings often meant the difference between being ambushed mid-climb and meeting the enemy on equal terms, a sentiment echoed by countless airmen who returned to bases like Duxford after missions that might otherwise have been their last. For ground crews and civilians alike, the distant hum of fighters taking off in response to a radar alert became a sound of reassurance, a sign that someone, somewhere, had seen the danger coming. In the darkest months of 1940, when Britain stood alone against a seemingly unstoppable foe, chain-home offered not just a tactical tool, but a psychological lifeline, a reminder that ingenuity could counter even the most overwhelming odds. The scale of this transformation was evident in the sheer effort behind the network's expansion. By mid-1941, over 50 chain-home and related chain-home low stations, designed to detect low-flying aircraft, were active, staffed by more than 2,000 personnel working in shifts around the clock. These stations, often perched on windswept cliffs or remote headlands, became symbols of quiet resilience, their operators hunched over screens in drafty huts while the fate of the nation hung in the balance. The financial commitment, initially so grudging, had ballooned to over $1.5 million by 1940, a figure that reflected the government's belated recognition of radar's indispensability. What began as a flicker on an oscilloscope in 1935 had, by the war's early years, reshaped the very nature of aerial defense, proving that a small idea, nurtured against all resistance, could alter the course of history.